Hello and welcome to part three. And where we left things off, I mentioned how it's nearly impossible to have a rational conversation about abortion. Both sides are partially to blame for this. At least if we look at the long-term picture, especially because politicians are going to politician, which I already mentioned before. But another reason is it's become more partisan than ever, and well, at least in terms of recent years, the Democrats are kind of a bit more guilty of this than the Republicans. I know that's going to sound like a partisan statement, but bear with me here. I'll explain why it's not. When Roe versus Wade was first decided, it was a divisive issue, but not a partisan one. There was a large amount of pro-choice Republicans and a large amount of pro-life Democrats, with the last pro-life Democrat to have any national prominence being Pennsylvania Governor Bob Casey, who's the same Casey in the 1992 Casey versus Planned Parenthood Supreme Court case that upheld Roe, but scaled it back a bit by applying Roe to the more narrow undue burden standard, which had previously been applied to cases revolving around other issues as far back as the 19th century, which said that states could restrict abortion as long as those restrictions didn't impose a quote-unquote undue burden, meaning, of course, that states did not outright ban it, which was very different than the more stringent strict scrutiny standards applied to restrictions, which is a much stricter standard for this sort of thing. But in other words, Casey did sort of pave the way for certain restrictions. So that's by creating that precedent. The religious right started to become prominent in the mid to late 70s and was at the height of their power during the Reagan administration, with abortion being one of their main priorities. While I agree that a just and loving God wouldn't approve of abortion and that Roe was a massive step backwards, this alliance between the religious right and the Republican Party has done far more harm than good for many reasons, including various ones unrelated to this issue. But one of the main ways it has, of course, it's made abortion a religious and cultural debate, which in the long run has shot the pro-life movement in the foot. A lot of this damage is being undone by pro-lifers my age and younger who may or may not be religious, but are taking a less partisan approach. One of the biggest groups in this new generation are actually pro-life libertarians, and yes, we do in fact exist, actually. Well, we're not a majority yet, but we're becoming more prominent. The libertarian case against abortion can be best summed up by the non-aggression principle, which takes what we were all taught as children, that you don't kill, you don't defraud or steal from people or harm them in any way. To us, abortion's a violation of that principle for the same reason homicide is, because, well, it's the initiation of violence against another person for reasons other than self-defense. But almost 50 years later, and in recent years, it seems like the Democrats are responsible for most of the polarization in the last 10 years or so, or 10 to 15 years maybe. Granted, much of this is a reaction to what I already just described, but if you've been paying attention lately, you're going to notice that the religious right still has power, but they're not nearly as dominant as they were in the past. But, the pendulum keeps swinging too far to the left, like it's been doing. We could end up seeing a resurgence of them in 20 or 30 years from now, and I really don't want that to happen. Donald Trump was the most socially liberal Republican to become president since Gerald Ford. Well, he had to pick Mike Pence as his running mate to get enough of the religious right on board. Trump rarely ever talked about issues like abortion or gay marriage. Yes, Trump is a culture warrior, but the culture war had changed considerably in the mid-2010s, with conservatives gradually starting to adopt more libertarian stances on some cultural issues, not all, but with concerns about political correctness and cancel culture really becoming much more dominant. Of course, the reason for this is because the Democrats have radicalized on abortion rather considerably. When I was growing up in the 90s, and even during, much of, my early adulthood in the 2000s, I remember most Democrats saying they weren't pro-abortion, that nobody was, but they simply wanted it to be safe, legal, and rare. And there are some people who still believe that, but gradually over the course of these last few decades, their position began to radicalize, while most people barely even noticed. Anyway, as I mentioned in part one, the Democrats have claimed that 70% of the American people support keeping abortion legal, but none of the statistics they cite state to what degree respondents believed it should be legal or say much about their methodology. Most people asking if abortion should be legal, you know, asking most people if abortion should be legal is not that surprising. Far fewer people tend to say that when you ask if it should be legal without restrictions. Now, there's one poll I found that indicates that only 19, and it's linked in the description, that indicates that only 19% of Americans agree that it should be legal with no restrictions, compared to 27% that believe it should be illegal in most cases and 8% illegal in all cases with no exceptions. Now, as you can see in the poll, if you bring it up, Americans are conflicted about the matter, yet the Democrats heavily implied that this 19% is the 70%. Still not convinced that the Democrats have lost their minds on this issue? Check out these two paragraphs of the Democratic Party 2020 platform, which is linked in the description of this video. And I dare you to tell me with a straight face that they or nobody else are pro-abortion. Linked in the description. Democrats are committed to protecting and advancing reproductive health, rights, and justice. We believe unequivocally, like the majority of Americans, that every woman should be able to access high-quality reproductive health care services, including safe and legal abortion. So, they use the same reductio ad populum fallacy I mentioned while framing abortion as both a healthcare issue and a civil rights issue, while using the terms safe and legal to make it sound more palatable to more moderate voters who may be reading it. In other words, abortion, according to this paragraph, or this section of the paragraph, is not much different than going to the doctor for a cancer screening or getting blood work done. Having that taken away would be like having taken away the right to bear arms or the right to decide whether or not to get vaccinated, which most Democrats and establishment Republicans don't have the best track record of honoring. Anyway, the paragraph continues by saying, we will repeal Title X domestic gag rule and restore federal funding for Planned Parenthood, which provides vital preventive reproductive health care for millions of people, especially low-income people and people of color and LGBTQ plus people, including in underserved areas. So they once again emphasize abortion as a health care issue, and, well, frankly, no, it's not. It only is if the mother's life is in danger. But anyway, they also argued in favor of forcing taxpayers like myself who want nothing to do with this to pay for other people's abortions by getting rid of the Title X gag rule, which Sleepy Joe did back in October, and funding the world's largest abortion mill. And, of course, sweeten the deal by pretending to care about the same poor people they screwed over with their unconstitutional and ineffective lockdowns, which we may end up seeing again thanks to monkeypox. Hooray! Anyway, that's for another video. While putting in some identity politics, of course, and there are two more paragraphs worth of this BS to read, but I think you get the idea. But this has to be only the blue state Democrats, right? Well, check out this clip of then Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, a Democratic governor of a swing state, I might add.
No exception. There was a very contentious committee hearing yesterday when Fairfax County Delegate Kathy Tran made her case for lifting restrictions on third trimester abortions, as well as other restrictions now in place. And she was pressed by a Republican delegate about whether her bill would permit an abortion even as a woman is essentially dilating, ready to give birth. And she answered that it would permit an abortion at that stage of labor. Do you support her measure and explain her answer?
Yeah, and I wasn't there, Julie, and I certainly can't speak for Delegate Tran, but I would tell you first thing I would say is this is why decisions such as this should be made by providers, physicians, and the mothers and fathers that are involved. there are, when we talk about third trimester abortions, these are done with the consent of obviously the mother, with the consent of the physicians, more than one physician, by the way. And it's done in cases where there may be severe deformities, there may be a fetus that's non-viable. So in this particular example, if a mother is in labor, I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother. So I think this was really blown out of proportion. But again, we want the government not to be involved in these types of decisions. We want the decision to be made by the mothers and their providers. And this is why, Julie, that legislators, most of whom are men, by the way, shouldn't be telling a woman what she should and shouldn't be doing with her body.
And do you think multiple physicians should have to weigh in, as is currently required? She's trying to lift that requirement.
Well, I think it's always good to get a second opinion, and for at least two providers to be involved in that decision, because these decisions shouldn't be taken lightly. And so, I would certainly support more than one provider.
All right, let's go back to the phones now for the governor. We're going to talk now with Mike, who's calling in.
This is happening, or excuse or rationalize it anyway. You're not just wrong, but you're evil. Sorry, not sorry. This was a governor, again, in a swing state, yet he was still prompted to make that horrid statement to appease the lunatic fringe in his base. I can't even begin to tell you how grateful I am that this horrible person is no longer governor, even though he was not my governor, and how horrified I am that my governor is just as bad as he is on that issue. Anyway, so stay tuned for part 3. When I mentioned the arguments these lunatics are making to effectively scare the crap out of everyone. Anyway,